The accusation thrown at Keir Starmer is that Labour doesn't have any ideas, doesn't have any policy. But this week we've seen two big reports. One's the Gordon Brown's Commission on the Future of the UK. The other is new policy today on startups and helping businesses. The proposals from Gordon Brown include, devolving new powers to housing, infrastructure, employment, to mayors and local authorities. Do you think they're radical enough proposals? Obviously, they're not Labour policy just yet, but we're consulting on them.
I certainly think they're radical enough, Rachel. It is true that there are holes in them and lots of question marks and lots of vague areas. Exactly what is devolved to whom, which towns and which cities have directly elected mayors across Scotland as well as England, which don't and why. Lots and lots of issues like that. And it's still unclear. I don't think there is going to be a sort of regional English system, and I hope there isn't, of assemblies, but all those kind of things are unclear. So lots and lots of questions. But is it radical enough in terms of being the centre-left or Gordon Brown's response to Boris Johnson's levelling up, to say that you can't level up unless you also pass real power down? Then I think it is radical and it is good. Frankly, there's a lot in it that Michael Gove would approve of, but then he's the radical on the Tory side on these measures.
Freddie, what do you reckon?
Yeah, no, I think we got to remember that it was a vague, quite ambiguous set of principles, and whether they're going to be able to implement on that or not depends whether they get a majority at the next general election. I think Andrew's right. It's a direction, it's a where they want to go. But I wrote about this on Tuesday, and I basically said the key thing for them is that devolution equals economic growth. I mean, this is part of their broader economic strategy. We got to remember back in July, Keir Starmer set out his growth picture in Liverpool, and the reports we've seen over the summer and this week link into that. So you devolve power, you give communities more say about who comes into the area, where the money goes, and hopefully you stimulate a little bit of growth. We also saw that in the report today on skills and startups. They said that they're going to try and funnel more money into small startups. Again, it's a policy with a focus on growth, and that's the main theme here.
In many ways, they're completely boxed in by the wider picture. There is not going to be any scope for very large extra public spending if Labour win the next election, and Keir Starmer, by ruling out any involvement in the single market or free movement, means there's not going to be a trading growth area there as well. So growth through trade is limited, growth through public investment is limited. So what's left? And what's left is devolution and the smaller scale ideas. I mean, there is no doubt that there is a massive, massive growth problem. Liz Truss was right about that. Maybe not about many other things, but she was right about the fact that there was a big growth problem. One other little factoid to throw onto the table, which absolutely astonished me, is some research out this week showing that 1 in 10 young people, which means 18 to 24-year-olds in this case, 1 in 10 never intend or expect to enter the labour market in their lives. We have a really, really big labour market problem. A problem of underpay and poverty comes from low growth and low productivity, and that is Labour's great challenge if they win power.
Yeah, I suppose the sort of flip side to that is that you could end up with a bit of a postcode lottery kind of system if you have different bodies kind of dealing with their own infrastructure, dealing with their own employment, what have you. So that's this kind of flip side to it.
If we forget about America and look at continental Europe, there's no really successful European country that doesn't have very strong city and regional layers of government. The Germans do, the French do, the effective bits of the Italian state do as well. And so I think there are lessons there for us.
Do you think Gordon Brown is sort of the right voice for reform?
Well, I think he's the only voice. He's not the only voice, but it's really interesting. Now that the sort of sniff of power in the air, all the old dogs from the 1990s and 2000s are coming back into the game, and Tony Blair's got his institute. I think Gordon has done some really hard, solid work. He is quite didactic. He doesn't brook much argument, people around him, but he is a voice that the centre-left of the Labour Party, as well as the centre and right of the Labour Party, still, to a certain extent, respects in a way they don't respect Tony Blair. And so I think it was quite a shrewd choice to go to him.
I think it's interesting because we are seeing these new Labour figures pop up among Starmer's top team over the past few months, and they're coming up with reports and suggestions. You know, Blair's made no secret of advising Starmer, same with Brown and others. So the question there is, how similar is Starmer's Labour going to be to New Labour? I mean, the key slogan in Brown's report was Old Britain to New Britain. That must have been intentional, I would have thought. So I think you're going to see some divergence. You've seen, I think, advocacy for a more interventionist state. I think you wrote about that last week, Andrew. I think you saw that in the report, but you also saw that in today's report. Seeing the state as partnering with business to try and bring about economic growth. You also saw it with immigration. They're no longer going to say, okay, you can have as many immigrants coming as you like to fund jobs and skill gaps and these sorts of things. We need businesses to step up, train people,
Investment in
as
skills,
will the state.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we think Keir Starmer's doing as leader at this point? I mean, I know there's an easy answer to that question given how far ahead Labour is in the polls, but how do you think?
Well enough. At the New Statesman, we were going to be week after week after week complaining about this or that, wanting to go further there or criticising this thing, of course. But yes, looking at the polls well enough. I think over the last few weeks, he hasn't done terribly well in Prime Minister's questions against Rishi Sunak, to the extent that that matters, and maybe it doesn't matter at all. But Sunak is proving a wilier and harder opponent, perhaps, than Keir Starmer expected. I thought he didn't really land the blows he should have landed, for instance, on housing policy this week, a really big area for Labour, and again, an area where we don't yet see a sort of solid and coherent policy.
I think I would disagree with that a little bit. I've been quite critical of Starmer's performances in PMQs in the past, and I think he's doing quite a good job nowadays, in part because Sunak's in such a weak position. He doesn't have to do that much to draw out where Sunak and the government are falling down. He can simply point at Sunak, point at his backbenchers, and he highlights the divisions within the party.
And the weak, he keeps that may cut through, it's true. I just think they are more evenly matched than we've seen Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition for some time. I mean, it's a very interesting thing to watch for those who are obsessive about it.
The interesting thing is that we've moved away from style in PMQs. I remember you used to almost have to sketch PMQs because the politics was the style, and now ideology, policy has returned, and that makes it much more interesting. It makes it harder to say, okay, this person clearly won because they had the wittier line or the quick takedown here or there. It's about the ideas and the political context when they both stand up and when they leave. It's about the key messages that come through, and I think on that framing, Starmer's doing a decent job.
So we've mentioned Rishi Sunak, so we'll move on to the Conservatives. So we've got this last week another 2 U-turns, one on onshore wind and making housing targets for councils mandatory. He's struggling with his backbenchers a great deal, Rishi Sunak, isn't he? Surely his New Year resolution has to be no more U-turns.
No more U-turns, but it's very, very hard for him because it's not just one group of backbenchers he's struggling with. There are lots of sort of competing factions on the Tory backbenches. And as more and more of them think, you know what, I'm not going to win my seat at the next election, or if I do, I've got a miserable 5 years or more as an opposition backbencher, and therefore I'm getting out. Authority starts to crumble. It's beginning to crumble and splinter all over the place, and that's his biggest problem. I think, by the way, the U-turn over housing is an immense story and a really, really bad one for the Conservatives. 300,000 houses every year we were promised in the 2019 manifesto. This U-turn, this lack of central control, means there is absolutely no chance of that happening. And Tory NIMBYism has trumped any sort of bigger ambitions for the country. I think it's incredibly bad news for younger voters. Tories are already losing lots of younger voters. And I think it's almost an election-losing U-turn, in my view.
Pushing up house prices and keeping people off the housing market.
Yeah.
How do you think Rishi Sunak's doing?
He's struggling massively. I mean, if you speak to Tory MPs at the moment, there's this big sense of despair, anguish. They constantly come out with gallows humour about their futures and joking about the strength of the party. So that's where they are mentally. And what does that mean? That means that Sunak can't actually push through an agenda. He can't create a policy platform which he can go to the electorate in 2 years' time and say, look, I came in 2 years ago and this is what I've achieved. I mean, as you said, Andrew, he hasn't got that strength to do that or the policy. So what is he going to say to them?
I think I can say that I was stopped yesterday in the Commons by a member of Rishi Sunak's government, a senior minister, who said, I read your piece in the New Statesman. You're very angry with the Conservatives and our record. Quite right. I thought, well, okay.
Is there something he can do to sort of turn it round now?
He just has to hunker down and wait, I think. I mean, as we said before, there's another 2 years before there has to be an election. That is a very, very long time. So many things can change. So much might turn up. They're already selling government debt more effectively than we perhaps expected by now. And, the impact of a year and a bit of relatively calm, relatively competent-looking government. I'm crossing my fingers and toes. I don't think it's going to happen, but if that happened, it could turn things round. In a relatively small period of time, the Labour lead in the polls has come down from around 30 to around 20. These things move fast.
To around 20, though, is still they're still behind by some margin. I mean, do you agree? Do you think that just a year of kind of quiet government and being seen as vaguely reliable?
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? This is the most compelling thing we can try and muster at the moment. I mean, Andrew, you had your great piece a few weeks ago where you set out the road to victory for them with the huge caveats of this is probably not going to happen. But if they say to the electorate, look, we made the recession slightly shallower, we stabilised the economy, we got us through the war in Ukraine, we got us through COVID, then maybe there's a narrative there. But if Sunak can't come up with his own agenda, I mean, that relates to what we were saying earlier, then he's really going to struggle.
Thank you very much for watching our podcast. If you'd like to know more about what's going on in UK politics, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel.